Hello, welcome to my continuing series on software heresy, or what do we think is true that might not be. And I haven't done one of these in a few months, but I have a list on my wall of some of the other topics I want to cover, and this one kind of popped at the top, and I thought it was about time I talked about it. So our topic for this time is agile transformations, or how NoAgile transformations, since all of my heresies are about saying we shouldn't do something. I'll start with my usual warning. Heresy can be uncomfortable or even a bit insulting. Try not to take it personally. So if you go out there and look, there are a whole lot of people saying we should do agile transformations. And more specifically, there are a whole lot of people whose business is around doing agile transformations. And that's been the state for quite some while. But there's a really interesting question. Are agile transformations agile? So is the word agile in agile transformations actually a modifier? Or is agile transformations as a phrase just a label for something? So, as often happens in my heresy, I need to go on a bit of a digression. And I'm going to go and digress into the database world, where I spend a fair bit of time. Database world has a concept known as a database transaction, at least in the relational database world. And the way a transaction works is we have a set of things we want to change in the database. But we're worried that something might happen in the middle, or we might end up in an inconsistent state. So database transactions let us create a set of database changes, and then we can try to apply them to the live database. And the important part about this is they all get applied at once. Then there's a check in the database. Was it successful? And if the answer is yes, then we keep the changes. And from a viewpoint of someone using the database is never in a bad state. So at the beginning, we're in a good state. At the end, we're in a good state. Well, what if it wasn't successful? Well, this is the neat part. The database reverts or rolls back the changes automatically. So we either end up in the state with the good changes applied, or we end up with none of the changes that were problematically applied. And then we come around and we do the next set of changes in the same manner. So database transactions are a way of ensuring that the database is always in a functional, healthy, consistent state. And that's a really good thing to have for your database. How does this apply to Agile? Well, I was once asked, what is Agile? And after a little discussion, the person asked me a more specific question. If you look at all the practices Agile teams do, what are the base level ones? What are the practices where if you took them away, you'd say that team isn't Agile anymore? And I think I came up with a couple, but this is the most important one. And it's all about the flow that Agile teams use. When we're talking about process. So somebody comes up with an idea and we try it out. And then we ask, was it a good idea? If it's yes, we keep doing it. If it's no, we stop doing it. Okay. This seems like a trivially stupid way for me to talk about process. And by stupid, I mean, it seems just really, really obvious. Of course, you keep doing the things that work out and you stop doing the things that don't work out. But in general, I don't think that's true. So let's talk about this in a little more detail. So for an idea to be testable, it needs to be a few things. Inherently, we need to be able to convince the people who are going to have to try the idea out that this is something worth testing. And what does that mean? Well, it needs to be something that they think A, isn't totally stupid, something that B, isn't really that big of a change, and something C, that is inherently a short-term thing. So, to put it another way, if I ask somebody to make a big change in how they work, and we're going to have to try that for 3 months, they're not very excited about it. If I tell somebody we're going to make a small change, and we're going to try it for a week, they're much more excited about it. So, inherently, both scope in size and scope in time are really important here. Now, the other thing that's really important is the third step, the was it a good idea step. And it's very important that this actually be a formal step, because one of the other things that drives whether people are willing to try something out is whether they think they have a chance of influencing what happens based on whether it was a good idea or not. So once again, if you ask someone, hey, I want you to try this idea, and then in 2 weeks, the managers are going to get together and they're going to decide, whether or not it's a good idea. They're not that excited about that. Where if you go to them and you say, hey, we want you to try this idea, and in a week, all of us are going to get together and we're going to talk about whether it was a good idea or not. So being able to have personal feedback to give your opinion about the idea and to hear what other people thought about the idea is really key to making it psychologically approachable or reasonable. So whether you can test the ideas, they need to be small, they need to be short, and they need to be something where I can give my opinion as to whether or not I thought it was a good idea or not. So once we've got that, we've chosen, we can go back around and do it again. And this loop here is, I think, one of the base things in Agile. If you are doing this sort of thing, even if you're not doing it in a super organized way, but if you are doing this sort of thing, I think you are doing Agile. Conversely, if you're not doing this sort of thing, regardless of the principles you're using, I don't think you're doing Agile. So to relate back to the database analogy, where we use database transactions to keep your database in a functional state, Agile assures that your methodology is always in a functional state. So we start and we're in a functional state that everybody knows about. We try a small thing and we decide if it's good. Okay, we've made a small change to our methodology. It's gotten a little better. If it's bad, we made a negative change to our methodology, so we're going to take it away. So this keeps our methodology healthy and functional and consistent. So how does this relate to Agile transitions or Agile transformations? Well, what does the Agile transformation look like? So the first step is you make a huge change in your organization. And it's hard to oversell how big this is. You change how people work with each other. You change how teams work internally. You change how teams work with other teams. You change how different roles within the teams work with each other. You change how work is defined. You change how work is broken down. You change how work is tracked and scheduled. You change how managers work with the teams and how they can figure out what is going on. You change often your release schedule. This is a big deal. It's changing everything about your organization. So that's your first step. And then what do? Well, after that, you just keep doing it. And I've watched a number of relatively big organizations, multi-team organizations, do Agile transformations. And this is what it looks like. They make all of these changes. A lot of these changes they don't really understand very well. And then they just keep doing it. And the reason they just keep doing it, there are a couple reasons for them just keep doing it. The first is that agile transformations are typically very prescriptive. And by prescriptive, I mean what you're supposed to do is very well defined. It'll be, you will do Scrum, and this is the way you will do Scrum, and we will give you training that tells you this is the way you will do Scrum, and this is how you will do it. So it's very much about telling people how to do it. And the second problem is that somewhere in management, somebody decided this was a good idea. So they've put a lot of their personal capital behind the idea of doing an agile transformation. And that means it's very, very unlikely that at that level, somebody is going to look at it and say, hey, this isn't going very well. So what inherently happens is they just keep doing it. Now, to bring up the other model, if we've done this agile transformation, so you notice I said you keep doing it. Well, can we do this agile flow that I talked about within that sort of transformation? Well, generally, I think the answer is no. Unfortunately, keep doing it means keep doing it the way we told you to, not try things and see if they're better. So not only do agile transformations, not only are they this big thing that you can't revert back, you really can't flip back to the old organization, at least not, without as much effort as it took you to flip into agile. But you can't even work with individual teams to try to improve things, at least the vast majority of things, because there's a specific way of doing it. So agile transformations are inherently what I would call a revolutionary approach. We're going to take this thing that we understood. Maybe we didn't have a very good methodology, but at least we understood kind of how that worked. And we're going to change a whole host of things about it all at once. And we're just going to hope that it's better. But we're actually not going to have any way of knowing whether it's better, nor are we going to have a process that helps us get to a point of figuring out how we could improve it. Where agile transformations, what I would call agile, is an evolutionary approach. We're going to work with small ideas, test them, and see if they're any good or not. And one of the somewhat ironic parts about this whole situation is that the sort of methodologies that are asserted to be the right methodologies in agile transformations didn't come out of a revolutionary approach. They came out of this bottom evolutionary approach, where specific teams tried stuff out. And they said, hey, what if we do things in iterations? Or what if we use this thing called unit testing? Or what if we do, any of a host of other agile practices? They either adopted practices from elsewhere or they invented things on their own. So they took their existing process and through a series of small changes, they evolved it into this process that worked pretty well. And then that process got pulled out and then stuck together and kind of imposed on people. And there's really no surprise that it just doesn't work very well. So this is why I think agile transformations are inherently a bad idea. That's this chunk of Heresy. I hope you've enjoyed it. Please come back for the next chunk.